we may get an interruption, or not an interruption, and a welcome visitor who might join us. So I hope everyone's doing well during this very, very strange time. I'm actually entering week 9 of being home because the museum shut and DC schools actually shut a little bit before then. So I hope everyone and their families and loved ones are doing okay, because this is a very, very strange time. So that said, I'm really excited to share with you guys this exhibit that I've been working on, and I'm just working on how to share my screen such that I'm sharing the right thing. Let me see here. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a project I've been working on for quite a while now. Here, let me see, it's not choosing. All right, I'm going to do this, and you're going to all see yourselves, and then hopefully you will see my screen. Is everyone seeing my PowerPoint front? Yeah, great. So what I'm going to do is talk about a project that's the result of a collaboration for quite a while now, actually. It's kind of gestated in 2011 and is taken various forms. So I'm going to talk about the research that I've been doing with colleagues around cellular technology, and then look at this exhibit we're doing, which is hopefully proceeding despite of COVID. So I wanted to foreground, though, in particular, and I'll get into my research collaborators as well. But in terms of an exhibit, I am the lead curator for the exhibit, Cell Phone Unseen Connections. But I think it's very important to acknowledge and to kind of show the other team members, right? From the writers to exhibit, educators, developers, designers, media. So it's quite a big team, as you can see here. And we've been working now for almost 2 years to bring this exhibit to fruition, which kind of started out as an idea of mine. I work, as it was mentioned, at the Smithsonian. I work at the National Museum of Natural History. I've been there now almost 12 years, which is hard to believe. I'm still a baby in terms of Smithsonian age, in terms of how long people have been there. But why I wanted to start at Natural History, and assuming everyone in the Washington area has been to our museum, we have a quite old, large anthropology department, which has an interesting place within the history of the Smithsonian. I would argue that a lot of, despite Boas's claims elsewhere, American anthropology really originated at the Smithsonian. So we have a long legacy there in terms of anthropology in the DC region. When I mention to people that I work on cell phones, I get a lot of reactions. One, it's the one project that I've worked on that everyone seems to understand. No one looks at me and thinks I'm crazy. As I'll get into, I work in Papua New Guinea, and when I mention that, 9 times out of 10 people don't know where it is. Mentioned endangered languages, I get reactions of, well, isn't it a good thing if we all speak English? Cell phones, you mentioned cell phones, everyone says, oh, right, interested. However, working at the Natural History Museum, we do get questions about, well, why would you do an exhibit like that at Natural History? And so hopefully one of the things in this talk was I will help you give a sense of why and what we're thinking about. Because I think this show is, as I've been saying for a while now, is a way to do at the kind of to fulfill a core mission of natural history, which is understanding the natural world and our place in it. And as you can imagine, speaking to the choir here, as anthropologists, anthropology plays a really critical role in understanding that. And so this exhibit really kind of fits in with a wider or longer trajectory of museum exhibits that we've been doing at the museum. If you've been there recently, we opened in the fall Deep Time, or was actually over the summer, Deep Time, which is our big revamp of our dinosaur hall. And why I mention that is because the central facet of that is looking at climate change. And then more recently, my colleague Sabrina Schultz and a whole team of experts in health have opened the show a year ago now, Outbreak, which looks at pandemics, which is unfortunately very, very timely. And so I mention that because one of the things that we are doing at Natural History is trying to break this mold of kind of this idea of what natural history museums do, and particularly what anthropology does in natural history. And so cell phones is part of that. Cell phones is a chance to kind of tell some kind of core stories about anthropology in terms of what it means to be human, and also flip the script, if you will, as I'll get into. And it's in keeping this show, which is a temporary show, which we hope to open, the God's willing, in November 2021. This will be a kind of a contemporary anthropology show, as I'll get into. Let's see here. The show has various different influences. As I mentioned, my background really is I started a lot of my work, particularly my dissertation work, working in Papua New Guinea. So I've been working there since 2000. And I mention that because it was really in the context of going back in 2006 and then 2010, 11, that I began to notice the impacts of cell phones in Papua New Guinea. And so I had done, my original field work was focusing on technological, looking at material culture change, social transformation in the wake of resource extraction. And so I've had this enduring interest in the way people relate to objects and how that impacts people's relationships to their environments. And unsurprisingly, when cell phones came into Papua New Guinea, which was in 2006, that began to reconfigure people's relationships. And it was thinking about that, and then thinking about my new title when I came to the museum in 2008, Curator of Globalization, that I kind of began to plant the seed of what is this current project, right? So thinking about cell phones, which I would argue are kind of the paradigmatic object of globalization. They are something in which we communicate with people globally, but then also they are made up of global supply chains. And so they raise a lot of interesting examples and ways in which for us to kind of think about globalization. So it was in that context that I began a series of conversations and collaborations with colleagues at George Washington University, some of whom you will know. Joel Kuipers was my first collaborator, then Alex Dent. And we formed a research team that really began in 2011 and has continued. And it's taken various shapes and forms, but at the core of it was our attempt to kind of understand from a kind of material, linguistic, cultural anthropology more holistically, what is it that cell phones are doing to us and how are they shaping us? And for those of you who know me, I mentioned my children. I have 3 small children. And one of the things that I had to do in kind of thinking about my career was, yes, I wanted to keep working in Papua New Guinea, and I am doing various collections projects through the Recovering Voices Initiative. But I also needed a different project to think through various things that would actually entail field work and that sort of thing. And so that's where this project came out of. And so we have focused since 2011 on the impact of cell phones globally, but really locally by looking at scenarios in Washington, D.C. And we've had an array of funding, both from George Washington and the Smithsonian, as well as the Winter Grant and the National Science Foundation. Joel, Alex, and I are just in the throes of finishing a 4-year NSF that looks at cellular telephony in the context of high school students. And so we spent 4 years doing research with students at School Without Walls and Woodrow Wilson High School here in DC to look at the ways in which cell phones are impacting both students or teenagers' notions of self, their relationships, at that kind of critical moment in which those of you who have children, teenage years, they're kind of expressing themselves in new ways, forming new friendships, and yet parents want to kind of control them, schools want to control them. So looking at that intersection of how this device is playing out in their social lives. Prior to that, we also have been doing a series of things, one of which on the left, I'm showing you a picture from the beginning work that we did, which we actually, when we started this project, we started doing survey work and tried to start doing kind of the standard ethnographic interviews with people in the DC area. We started with GW students and kind of began, and also looked at Latino population in DC and had various inroads. But perhaps not surprisingly, so this was 2011, people were really wary to talk to us as anthropologists, and partly because they didn't know us that well, about how they use their cell phone and all these things. And so I raised that because actually doing anthropology of cell phones and with cell phones is actually quite difficult. And so we actually stumbled upon what I'm showing you here in the left image, which is cell phone repair shops. And so we ended up focusing on third-party repair vendors and did 1.5 years of ethnography, which we've published in Anthropology Quarterly, as well as an edited book that Joel Kuipers and I have done. And so we kind of looked at the ways in which knowledge is distributed and reconfigured in cell phone repair shops. So here you have, back in that, so 2012 to 13, you have a period in which our devices largely black boxed. Most of the companies did not, and do not want you to repair them yourselves, and they don't want you to go to third-party vendors for various reasons. And so we were interested in unpacking how is it that these third-party repair vendors actually understand these devices, what are the supply chains they activate to get the parts, and how are they managing these broken devices. And then that led to a series of questions which cascaded into the cell phone project in terms of teenagers, but also more recently in 2018, we spent the summer working with interns at the Smithsonian and as well as GW students, looking at the kind of rollout of 5G. And so how does 5G and kind of infrastructure both maybe challenge socioeconomic difference or disparities in DC, or reinforce them? And so not surprisingly, within our NSF study, one of the things that became very clear looking at teenagers and cell phones was the differential access. And so how these devices both ameliorate and accentuate socioeconomic hierarchy in the city. And so we could talk about that more, but so that's the sort of the tenor of the research that we've done. We're working on a book project to kind of round that work out. But I mentioned that to kind of situate where this exhibit comes from, right? This exhibit is kind of grounded within the work we've done in DC, my understanding of things in Papua New Guinea, but then also, as if you've been following, there's been an explosion of literature around cell phones. And that work is differentially good and bad, but there's a lot of interest in cell phones and what it is and isn't doing to us. So if there's a research component to this, there's also a really kind of personal one. So I'm showing you on the right a picture of my daughter, Maya, who's 4, and she's kind of not with the cell phones, but she's hooked into one of our tablets, which of course, in the light of COVID, have become more and more important. And I raise that because, this is an image which digital devices are a lightning rod of sorts, because they raise a lot of issues around people's media ideologies. That is, how people understand what you should use and what you shouldn't use. And so part of this project is unpacking that, thinking through this particular moment in which, for some of you looking at this image, you can think, oh, how sweet, here are this his daughter is connected to the world and learning, to those contrasting that with some of you who may be looking, oh, look at, this is an example of a parent, who isn't paying attention to their child, right? And lost to the digital realm. And so this kind of dystopic and utopic view of technology. And so thinking through that, and I mention that because, as you know, as anthropologists, every technology that we as humans have invented have involved this kind of spectrum of reactions, of kind of fears about what this technology will do to us, as well as hopes and dreams. And I think cell phones are a perfect example. So one of the things that's really critical here in terms of this research, as well as this exhibit, is we've been trying to document and tap into a very particular historic moment. I think maybe even 5, maybe even less, 10 years certainly from now, a lot of, I think, our concerns about this technology are going to be very, very differently understood, right? And that's a standard aspect of any technology. The image on the left is from the GW campus, and I like it in particular because we're also living through a moment in which we're also trying to figure out, how do you use this? And this is a sign on the GW campus so that students don't walk into traffic, right? And so, everyone is walking around with their cell phone in their hand, looking at it as a, iPhone zombie or Samsung zombie or whatever you call it, stumbling around looking at their phones all the time. And so this is designed to kind of stop accidents from happening. So we have a kind of moment here that we're tapping into with this exhibit and the research, which I think is critical. So one of the things in our exhibit is we've been arguing for a while now that the story of cell phones is at once a human story, it's also an ecological story, and it's a natural history story. And this is part of our framing this and why we should have an exhibit like this at Natural History, and how this show, because I get a lot of feedback that, when I talk to people like, oh, you're gonna do a kind of evolution of the cell phone and show all these cell phones. That's not what this show is. It's very different from that, although there are aspects of it. So here I just want to unpack some of our main messages. And one of the core messages is that cell phones cannot be divorced from the natural world, right? So one of the aspects of this show is, if you will, doing a kind of metaphoric exploded diagram. And so thinking about the various supply chains, the places that are bound up in the device, and the kind of circular economy that it is part of. And getting people to realize that technology is not outside of nature, but deeply embedded in it in terms of what it does and where the raw materials are that are then made into things that the technology is, but then also that we are part of that. And so that's, as an anthropologist at a natural history museum, that's kind of one of my real kind of champion things, is to get people to realize that how we are embedded within the natural world. Another aspect of the show is getting people to think through that, cell phones are everywhere, but that the global network and infrastructure that supports them is often invisible. And so here the show is an attempt to use the cell phone as an example to kind of map out a series of relationships in a very classical anthropological way, right? So make the otherwise hidden connections we have visible. Then a third goal of the show is that people use cell phones to connect and communicate with others in ways that are once personal and cultural. Now, for an audience like you, I mean, the fact that cell phones are understood through the lens of culture is not surprising. But I think for a lot of our visitors for whom culture is a kind of maybe not well understood concept, or there's this view that technology rolls out and basically dictates how we are as humans, here's a chance to flip that script and say, actually, yes, there's certain affordances that technology creates, and it maybe dictates certain behaviorals depending on the input and the parameters of it. but we always understood everything we do through culture. And so a chance for us, as I'll get into a little bit further or in more depth soon, a chance to highlight culture as a kind of really importance. Fourthly, then, chance for the show is also to raise the cell phone technology we create and use also shapes us. And so here, you know, again, for anthropologists, not a kind of shocking message, but I think for a lot of people, the average visitor, right, getting people to understand that there's this dialectical or circular relationship with things is a critical part of the show. Now, where the show perhaps differs from natural history exhibits prior is our target audience is really teens and young adults. I kind of joke with the team, I mean, and what the delimitations of that are like kind of 12 to 24. I like to push the team to think of it in 30-year-olds. But here we have a chance with this show, and the reason we've chosen this, you know, all our shows at Natural History are all ages, with the idea that intergenerational, and this show will be that, right? If you are not 12 to 30, you're not going to not enjoy this show. But this show is what we're trying to do here is research has shown in exhibits and the museum that, you know, 12 tends to be the age in which kids are no longer interested in natural history, and the interest in science declines. And so what we're trying to do is to use something that either everyone has in their pocket or they want to kind of explore some central questions for anthropology as well as STEM, larger STEM. And so that's different for us. So what I want to do now is I want to turn to the exhibit itself and walk you through it. And we are right now in the 65% phase. That is, we're wrapping that up by the end of the month. Although, as you can imagine, with COVID, doing some of the things that we want to do is proving to be a little more difficult because we can't go into the building, and I'll get into that, and I'm happy to answer questions. But I will have this slide in the corner. But essentially, for those of you who know our exhibit, exhibit halls, this is on the second floor. This is where the last American dinosaur was. This is a 5,400 square foot space, so quite large. And it is off of the north side of the museum, near Objects of Wonder. And so it's between Objects of Wonder and then where the butterfly and mummy space is, and the bone hall. And so the introduction, I'll walk through it, but so this is a dynamic space that we're looking to have, and the idea is the show will be up for 3, possibly 4 years, depending on things. And as I said, it's a chance for us to kind of do what I think is an innovative or experimental topic for natural history. And I mentioned several different ideas that guide us, one of which is this question: what do you touch when you hold our cell phone? Or what do we touch when we hold our cell phones? And I'm thinking here of the kind of metaphoric and real materials that are in the device, but also the people and places that kind of help to make it. And then secondly, what are the unseen connections that we have to the world through our devices? One of my hopes as a curator for the show, or the curator for the show, is that at the end of this, people will leave the exhibit thinking about their devices differently, thinking about their connections to the world differently, and hopefully with more mindful kind of thought process. The purpose of the show is not to condemn cell phones. It's not to have people walk in and look at their device and throw it out, but rather to actually appreciate it in a much more nuanced way, and to kind of, I think, situate anthropology in Natural History Museum in the 21st century, right? So it kind of breaks some of those stereotypes that anthropology in museums just studies people from the global south or just studies pottery and is kind of stuck in the 19th century, right? So what does the intro look like? So we have this intro experience, and if you've been in natural history, we get about 5 million visitors a year. So we are not hurting for visitors, but we do have to design an intro experience that captures people's imaginations, because we're competing with, when people come to the Smithsonian, one, they tend to not realize that we're 19 museums and various research centers, but they come and maybe will spend an hour, hopefully more, in our building, and then they go around the mall. So the trick here is, how do you convince people to take time out of looking at the Hope Diamond, dinosaurs, and to focus in on something that they might not otherwise be interested in? So we've developed this idea of a cell phone forest. And so these will be larger than life cell phones that will basically, hopefully, all people, and get them. It'll have various messages will flash, which will preempt them for various things that they'll come into, but to kind of, magnify this small device in most of our pockets, and to kind of wow people. They're going to then walk into the show, and you can see on the upper right hand, so we'll be in the central part of the show up here, and what this part of the show is our resource section, i.e., what is the stuff that actually makes up your phone? Depending on who you talk to, there are about 30 essential elements, minerals. It's actually probably, but the actual scope and scale of it is about 80. What I'm working on right now, because the exhibit project is ongoing, is to nail down a good number. Once we do that, this central image here of this sculpture is a kind of exploded sculpture, and it's a chance for us to unpack what are the different elements and minerals in the periodic table that are in your device, and where are they found globally distributed, and why does that matter? Who are the people that use these? We, around the case, around this central sculptural element, we're going to have 8 case studies in 4 cases. So you can see on this map here, these kind of walls at an angle. And we're going to have up here, tantalum and lithium will be one to unpack issues around mining. We'll also then have copper and nematium. So think about end of life and how industry is working on recycling and getting materials, capturing materials out of the circular flow. Looking at gold and silicon to highlight the various ways in which different materials are used in the manufacturing process. And then aluminum and indium to think about how this device is made, so that in the case of aluminum bauxite, aluminum silicate, that is, how, through a product like Gorilla Glass, how this device is actually made to be more durable in terms of the screen. And then indium is the kind of one of the key elements that actually allows the screen to be touchable. So to unpack the science of that. And so throughout this section, we're going to think through the material science of that. And so this is where I'm working very closely with my colleague Michael Wise in Mineral Sciences. So to unpack the kind of minerals, if you will, but then also the people. Who are the people, and where are these minerals elements found? And so this is a mock-up of what these cases are going to look like. We're taking inspiration from various photographic sources. The goal here and throughout the show is actually we're doing interviews with real people along the supply chain. And so the idea here is that people will get to see life-size portraits of individuals who actually work along the supply chain and get to kind of see what their life is. So we're doing interviews, asking them about their job, asking them about what their life is like, and featuring that as part of the show. Here's a more kind of hot off the press, what that would look like for the case of tantalum and lithium. And here, as you can see, we're still working out some of these design motifs. We're probably going to most likely do action shots of people in work. And you can imagine for something like tantalum, which of course is part of that cluster of minerals that are part of the conflict minerals, that featuring an artisanal miner could prove to be an issue. And so we're working through some of that, because one of my goals as an anthropologist, of course, is we're representing people in an ethical fashion, ways that they want to be represented and featured, and kind of working through that. In this, we're going to have maps which will show the distribution, and that needs to be, this is a mock-up, of course, as well as then the actual minerals that the elements are derived from. This is where natural history, of course, has in its collections all the stuff that goes into your phone in terms of minerals. We're also going to feature tools and other objects in this cases to help bring the personal stories more into view and to life in that sense. So moving from this core section, we're going to go into infrastructure. So infrastructure really, and this for some people is the hardest part of the show to wrap their head around. But in many ways, I would argue is one of the most essential parts, because this is the section in which we will answer, what does it take to make your cell phone work, right? And unpack the science of when I use my cell phone and it works as a radio, right? The signal that goes to the tower that then sends it down to the various computers and then routers into the data centers and the fiber optics. How does that work? And so we're going to walk people through what doing a domestic phone call would look like, as well as an international call, and get them to see all the stuff that's actually involved. So here I've put up a little graphic that we've mocked up to show and help explain some of spectrum and issues around spectrum, the bandwidth that they use as part of the spectrum. And so this, for me, actually has been one of the most interesting sections, and it ties back to some of the work I've done with my colleagues at GW in kind of mapping infrastructure, cellular infrastructure in DC. And so, again, this is where we will kind of unpack the issues involved in, making a cell phone work. What is the stuff? And then start thinking around 5G. What are the possibilities of 5G? We've done a lot of conversations with various representatives of cellular telephone or cellular communication companies. And it's fascinating to talk to them about 5G, about the promises and actually what it will do. But this is where we're thinking through, we will think through what the Internet of Things will look like, and start unpacking that for visitors. My slide's not doing what I want. One of the things here, and I've blocked the image I wanted, I was supposed to have an animation, which is not working. This part of the show here is going to be the cultural section. So how do people use cell phones around the world? And I'm going to do something here to see if I can get this. I will undo this. So one of the things that we are doing is, sorry, technical issues. This section we will do, there we go. People will walk in and we're going to have on the wall before cell phones and then with cell phones. And so in this section, we're going to unpack the technological worlds that cell phones have kind of encapsulated. And so that was the graphic I showed you before. We're going to literally have a wall of technology that cell phones have not replaced, but kind of encompassed in various ways. So have things from a flashlight to money, photographic album, a Walkman, record player, et cetera, to get people to realize the kind of technological encapsulation that cell phones, smartphones have actually been part of. And then the rest, so that will be 1/3 of the wall, and then the rest will look at the kind of cultural production that comes out of cell phones. Again, we're going to feature people, and I'll get into those people, but the stories that we're working on primarily, and of course with any exhibit, my team likes to remind me, this is not a book, less is more, Josh. Don't get too excited about all the detail we can get to. We're going to deal with mobile money. We're going to deal with a broad topic of identity expression, and then also language as well as new languages. Mobile money, those of you know, that's a story really where we can highlight, particularly we're going to look at M-Pesa, but we'll also look at it more globally to look at the differential aspects of which mobile money are transforming things. Within the kind of identity expression, we're going to look at things. One of my favorite objects here at the bottom is a fantasy coffin from Ghana that's in African art. It is a Nokia cell phone, and we're going to have that on loan as a way to think through cell phones as expressions of cosmological connection. We've got another example here of this is in NMAI, National Museum of American Indians collections. This is a beaded cell phone case from an Apache beater. And so we want to feature this as well as other bedazzled cell phones from Japan, etc., elsewhere. Feature different cases. So the ways in which people use cell phones to create or express their identity. I just actually collected through Amazon, which is a very unusual way to collect something, joss paper, which is the spirit money that in Chinese traditions is burnt. And part of that, there are cell phones that are burnt for ancestors. And so we were going to feature joss paper as part of that. So thinking through some of the kind of tangible objects that people use, but then also things like the story of emojis, right? Which emerged in Japan in the 80s and has become a global phenomenon. As part of that, we'll also be featuring language revitalization. So here's a different perspective of that same space. You can see the before cell phones jam-chocked with different objects, and then the after. One of the things that we, of course, will be featuring is things like TikTok, other video kind of productions that people are doing. So one of my colleagues and friends, Jennifer Deeger, we're working with her to feature the work that she's been doing and documenting with Arnhem Land Aboriginal communities, or Lungu, particularly their kind of beautiful and amazing pictorial work that kind of expresses ancestral connections. I mentioned the emojis. We just interviewed a young woman who was at the forefront of kind of petitioning for the hijab emoji. So we're going to have in these pillars, you can see, got it down here, portraits again of individuals. And so right now we're looking at doing a portrait of this young woman who did the hijab emoji. Also, we're working on nailing down someone who is using apps to do language revitalization in a North American context, but then also someone who's a media maker. And so we just interviewed a young man who lives in the Washington, D.C. area who uses his cell phone to create things. So again, we're looking at kind of the cell phone as both itself a cultural artifact, but also something that becomes a platform through which other forms of cultural expression are created and generated. I showed this. This was a partnership that right now is abeyance, to mention kind of the impact of COVID. This is Shared Studios. If those of you who know Shared Studios, they do amazing things. Shared Studio does stuff where you basically can walk into a shipping container or something else that through then video software, you can talk to people around the world. We are in communication with them about having that be part of the show, and then using that as an existing network of relationships they have globally to put our visitors in dialogue with people from around the world to have conversations about their use and understanding of cell phones, social media. But as you can imagine, in the kind of post-COVID environment, fundraising for a show like ours has become very difficult. And so this is one of the things that has had to go into holding pattern. And unless we find kind of a donor, most likely will not happen because of the cost. We've had to cut costs. And so in lieu of this, what we're looking at, and it's this section, this wall, this area in here, we're most likely going to have a series of videos that we'll be playing, a kind of video screening room to kind of make up for that. And, you know, one of the realities for a show like this is we are Smithsonian has federal money, but we're also dependent on donors. And COVID-19, for all of you know this, has really kind of upended what the kind of donation world looks like and the ways in which moving forward, how museums are going to raise money, which is interesting. And another topic we can talk about in our conversation. Another aspect of the show up here is this circular economy. So what happens when you're done with your cell phone? When you decide to get a new one, you decide to discard it. And here what we're going to do is walk people through, do you keep it? What are the impacts of that? You discard it, you repair it, resell it, recycle it. This is a global story, so we're using examples from the global north as well as the global south to kind of unpack that for visitors and hopefully get them to see what are the implications of the decisions that they make and why these decisions matter as a consumer as well as just a citizen and person in the world. The last section is the influence section. This is the most, it's the trickiest section. I mentioned kind of the flashpoints people have about loving, hating, feeling ambivalent about cell phones. This is the least didactic, or not that the exhibit's didactic. This is the part of the exhibits that actually will really center on conversation. And so what we're looking at in this is this wall space will be covered with graphic novel. And we're looking at, for those of you with kids, if you know Nathaniel Hale, who does Hazardous Tales, fantastic series of historical graphic novels. This, for me, is the inspiration to think through this. But imagined dialogue between three people that will walk our visitors through issues related to health and concerns people have about health and cell phones, privacy, and constant connection. And so this will allow us to kind of spark people's imagination so that they will talk to other visitors as well as work with guided educators who will help them work through what is it, how are cell phones shaping our lives? What does it mean that we now, the government is using cell phones to track us to help with COVID-19, amelioration efforts. The fact that we can use the same devices to help call out, Black Lives Matter, issues of racial injustice. What does that mean, right? And how do people feel about that? And so what we're looking at is a kind of a central space. It's kind of mocked up here in some ways, in which we'll have a facilitated discussion, a kind of a card game that will get people and prompt people. I mentioned this because one of the things that we're also wrestling with in this, and this is from a recent infographic that's been circulating about media consumption in the COVID-19 era, is we're also really interested in this section, thinking about what the future of this technology is. And so one wall in this space will also be dedicated to people who are on the forefront of reshaping cellular technology. So that is people, we have great examples of people in the global south, Chile, for example, who are using the devices to create early warnings, or not early warnings, but actually allowing cell phones to work after an earthquake. How are people making cell phones more sustainable? What are the social justice uses, right, for this technology? And so we're going to have a wall in which these people will be featured and you'll be able to learn about them, but also prompt the visitor to think through, how is this technology shaping us? And, I kind of use this a bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm very suspect with, generation as an actual category. I think it's largely imagined. But thinking through having that conversation with different people in this space will be important. Now, for an exhibit like ours, you can imagine any exhibit is a snapshot in time. And so we're looking at finishing this, the research and the writing in about early November of this year, which then will get us a year to roll things out. Trick there, of course, is that with anything things change. And so our challenge is, how do we make the most stable story we can so that when the show is up for 3 years, it doesn't look like it was made in 2021, right? And it's dated. So this is where the cell phone lab comes in. And this is a space where the educators are going to work. We've got a number of ideas. One is kind of get people into this space, and it will be a DIY maker space. So thinking about how engage with our visitors to think about apps. How do you make apps? What are the apps for a healthier planet? Looking at phone of the future. How can we design phones that actually will impact the world less and actually be more sustainable, and get people to understand, well, this is why we use specific materials in the phone, and what are the kind of affordances, and kind of what do we lose when we don't have a touch screen, for example. We're also going to look at doing a repair lab, and then also thinking through what is the media and how do we use our devices to tell stories in a more effective manner. This will be balanced out with our usual film screenings, nerd nights, after-hour programming, etc. Another aspect of the show is a DIY element that museums around the world will be able to download and put up temporary shows. This is something we've done in the case of Outbreak to great effect. And so this is a model that we're exploring to try to make the messages that we have that people may be not able to access because they don't have the same access to digital infrastructures, or they can't come to DC. How do we expand the reach of our work? So we're hoping through this show to kind of, one, challenge people to think about what natural history is, but also kind of connect deeply to STEM and foster new interest in science, engagement with anthropology, to kind of think more critically about the world we live in, and also empower our visitors to not be afraid of this technology, but to really, in a good anthropological sense, come to understand it. I want to end with our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, who's an amazing man and has been kind of cast into deep waters with COVID-19 as our secretary. But one of the things that he has commented about prior to COVID-19 is wanting to make the Smithsonian a place where people can go, as he says, to wrestle with that, to find the tools to live their lives. I want people to see that we're as much about today, tomorrow, as we are about yesterday. So this exhibit, in many ways, is an attempt to kind of foster that, and to, I think, in this vein, have critical conversations, on the one hand, about what it means to be human in the 21st century, and to kind of think through how technology is and isn't shaping us. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions. And I'll stop sharing. So I can now see you all. So I don't know how you guys want to do the Q&A. I'm happy to people unmute and raise their hands, but.
Yes, that's what I'm just going to say. Let's see, I'm going to unmute. Now you are unmuted, but you might want to mute yourself. You can unmute, you can remute yourself so that you don't up as the main screen, because right now you're the main screen.
Terry.
Maybe I don't know. I'm not sure how this works exactly. Maybe I need to mute all.
You can mute everyone if you like.
Yeah, that okay. And then you can unmute yourself when you have a question. Sorry about that. I just got a little confused.
Just that I'll answer Ed's, and then I see.
I can see Ed.
Okay.
Yeah. So Ed asks, what a treat to get to walk through this. Curious as to whether you have contacted any anthros at Gallaudet, perhaps for programming at the lab. Issues of accessibility and thinking through how cell phones have transformed, that is something that we are working on. We haven't talked to them per se yet, but they are on the list to talk to. One of the things in the infrastructure section that we are doing is developing a rail that's accessible, so it'll be a touch for those with sight impairments or accessibility issues. So people will be able to actually feel the different technologies that allow your cell phone to work. but yeah, that is something that will be very interesting and is a kind of critical issue, because I know with accessibility issues, particularly with sign language, the ability to do what we're doing, but through the cell phone, has really been transformative. I think one of the challenges that I've had as the curator for the show is it's a huge topic, and how do we condense that? But that is something that we've talked about in the culture section, but then also the education section would be an easy one. I think what we're looking at, and maybe it's unfair to the educators, is that circular education, more fluid space will be the way in which we're able to kind of update the exhibit and do what we call scientists is in, and have people come in and talk about their work vis-a-vis cell phones, et cetera, and kind of create perhaps ephemeral, but ways to enrich what's actually on the floor. But that's a great question. Anyone else? Yeah, I see, but maybe I'll go with Suzanne. I can't hear you. You're mute.
I'm still muted?
No. Now you're good.
Okay. I just wanted to note, this isn't a question, but when you were talking about cultural uses of cell phones, this came to mind. A few weeks ago, well, Jazz Fest in New Orleans was canceled for obvious reasons, because you can't get together. It was supposed to be a couple of weeks ago. Everybody was brokenhearted. My daughter works there and lives there, right? So I know all this. And because of this, local musicians, local great musicians, decided they would hold it online. And they did. It was only a weekend, but you had Irma Thomas, the Branford and Ellis, not Ellis, obviously, Branford and Wynton Marsalis, and so on. This went out to everyone because of cell phones. Mm-hmm. My daughter, who was working at home, she's supposed to be at City Hall, but working at home, was working and had her cell phone so she could work and go to the Jazz Fest at the same time. Jazz Fest is very expensive. The tickets cost quite a lot. Almost everybody has a cell phone. So this made Jazz Fest accessible to everyone across the city. So I was just thinking, it's a way to facilitate and democratize a cultural event that's very important, and probably, I won't say save the spirit of the city, but they were going to be very sad that they didn't have it this year. So
that's a great example. I mean, I think, one of the things that I think I'm going to be doing something through the museum. We're doing these Zoom presentations as curators, and I think I'm going to revisit something about this project and cell phones. And, it's funny, I have a very ambivalent feeling about my cell phone, right? I kind of love it some days, I hate it the other days. But I think it's fascinating how being stuck in one's home, I actually appreciate my cell phone much, much more, right? Like, I've been thinking historically, with the Spanish influenza and what it was like to live through that. And, yes, they had the telegraph. Yes, they had the telephone. But the ways in which information flows through our devices, but more importantly than that, the ability to kind of connect to friends, family, loved ones is quite remarkable and comforting in a way. So I've actually come to see my cell phone in a lot more, I appreciate it a lot more, which is interesting. I see, and I can't see everyone. So I'm gonna go, if the best way to ask a question maybe is to type something. And I will go to Laurie after I go to C. Cran. Sorry, I don't know your first name. And you're on mute. I think you're muted.
Kathleen Crane.
Oh, there you are. Oh, I think you're muted.
She's actually not muted, but I'm not sure why we can't hear her.
All right, try again. We heard you for a little bit.
Yeah.
Can't hear you, unfortunately.
And maybe, Kathleen, maybe you can type it in? We're not hearing you for some reason.
I don't think she realizes. I think whoever's the
Yeah, she's
main,
muted.
whoever's the main, I think it's Laurie. You can unmute her as the
No,
host.
she is unmuted. That's me.
Oh,
But, oh, I heard her.
Okay.
oh, there.
Here we go.
That's not gonna work. Mike,
Here.
I'll type my comment out.
Okay.
Okay. All right. While you're doing that, I will go to Laurie's question. She mentioned, you mentioned dividing the culture into education, etc. How are you characterizing apps? So apps are part of the cultural section. So I'm not entirely sure. We're not really dividing the cultural uses. There is no education section per se, but we're rather exploring different uses of the cell phone. So as I mentioned, language will be one. Apps will be part of that. And the tricky thing here is, you know, with any exhibit, we don't want to, how do we represent the diversity of apps out there without kind of, promoting one over another, right? And so we're going to be thinking through how different apps are used, right? So I see the smartphone and the ways in which the kind of media ecology in your phone, that's part of this story. So we're going to unpack that. I don't know if that answered your question. But the apps we're going to look at are kind of an array of things, right? Anything from language learning to photographs, taking photographs, to listening to music, etc. So the goal is to kind of prompt people to have discussions and to be as representational as we can, as well as being mindful of the differences. So I've got a question here from Reading. Looks like lots of material culture presented. Are there components related to issues like culture change, healthcare identity that have been impacted by tech? I guess I need you to expand on that. This show is not going to have a kind of, we do not have a stories per se on how cell phones have changed community, X community, right? So we're not going to be looking at, you know, where I work, for example, in the Prairie Delta, how cell phones have, we're not going to have case studies like that. But we will, you know, through the example of, through my working with my colleague Jennifer Deeger, you know, in her case, Arnhem Land, where she works, the cell phone has allowed people, she has a fascinating short film called Ringtone that I highly recommend. And in Ringtone, it looks at how people have made their cell phones deeply cultural, in the sense that people use ringtones that relate to their totemic spirit being. And so that's a nice example in which people have their cultural diversity has flourished, or distinctiveness has flourished. Certainly there are examples where cultures have changed through cell phones. And I'm trying to think a good example of that. We are going to be using the revitalization angle. So there are nuances to that. So we will be showing that. The health impact, that's an interesting one. In terms of healthcare, you need to unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just yammering here. Okay. Places like in Africa where it's had a significant impact on community health, cell phone technology and texting. Obviously, you could fill the whole building with all of the impact. So I'm mindful of that when I throw the question out there. But just these various ways that that it has impacted. That being just one of many. Health, for example, has just revolutionized a lot of healthcare in rural areas where people don't have access to a lot of other services.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, that is not an explicit story that we're going to get into. We are, in the sense, we're going to be looking at mobile money. So that's a nice example that, like healthcare, and the reason I chose mobile money is, when you think about Africa and cell phones, people tend to think conflict minerals, and so therefore, reinforce certain stereotypes of Africa as a continent being unstable, etc. I love the story of mobile money because it flips the script and shows how much further along they are than us. And so that's one way in which we're going to counteract and kind of show the differential ways in which this technology is impacted. I think in terms of the health issues, we haven't finalized the culture section. We were going to look at how with cell phones, medicine has been transformed in diagnosis and that stuff, but it may, sad to say, have gotten the chopping block just for space. But this is a great example of where, Expert is in having conversations as part of our adult programming would help to flesh that out a bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thanks.
I see Matthew here mentioned having challenges about the anthropology of cell phones. Right. What sort of challenges did you encounter and approach expansions of your research through digital ethnography? So my colleagues Joel and Alex and I are actually writing a piece for Sapiens right now. And I think the thing about cell phones, and this is a bit of my bias, I think the best ethnographies out there around this technology are by ethnographers who know the communities they work in very, very well. And so I'm thinking of Julie Archambault up in Concordia. She did Julie Soleil Archambault. She did a great ethnography in Mozambique. She didn't go there to work actually on cell phones at first, but cell phones became prominent in her kind of discussion with women and issues of intimacy and kinship. And I raise that because there the cell phone became part of a larger social phenomena, right? Which we know that they are part of. I think the trick in doing cell phone ethnography well, and good examples of cell phone ethnography, or there's the social media work out of England, UCL, that Danny Miller and his group have done, how the world changed social media. I think it comes down to, at least in my case, when I worked in Papua New Guinea with the communities, and I know in the Prairie Delta, they have no problem talking to me about their cell phones. In the US, with people that we are just getting to know, cell phones are, very much more personal, right? And to the extent to which people will want to reveal actually how much they use their cell phone versus what they like to think they use it for, is interesting. Also, being 46, middle-aged white guy, not many teenagers wanted to have us follow them around all the time. And so we worked with younger research assistants, graduate students, and as well as undergrads at GW, as well as high school students, to kind of do more participant observation work. So what I was getting at is there's always this gap between what you can observe, what you can then do self-reports, and then actually engage with in real time. And so if you know the literature, one of the prominent people out there, she's not an anthropologist, is Sherry Turkle, who kind of has this book that came out even 10 years ago, or maybe 6, called Alone in a Crowd, right? So she talks very much about how this technology has gotten in the way of us communicating. Now, if you've read the book, it's very much a meditation on her own problems with her own teenage daughter who's going off to college. And so it's a very biased piece. And I actually, as an anthropologist, I think it makes some interesting points, but it's got the problem of it's actually not ethnographic, right? And then you have further issue with, you've got that kind of media ideology bias as the ethnographer, if you will, the problem of how do you collect this stuff. Dana Boyd did a lot of work with kids, and she did a lot of hanging out in community centers, and that's been really a great model of the work. And she got these kids to open up and talk to her. But again, it's still self-report. Danny Miller and Heather Horst in their work in Jamaica, and they had the first book on cell phones in 2006. I've never been able to confirm it, but a lot of that ethnography rests on the fact that Heather Horst had done work in Jamaica for a while. And so she knew the people, because they go through people's cell phones and figure out, well, who are you calling, and that sort of stuff. With the teenagers we worked with, they were willing to talk to us, but we really relied on more self-report. So there's this interesting tension on how do you actually get into the mechanics of the device? How do you get them to open up? There's now out of Stanford a group that's doing, what is it called? It's like Screennomics, where they're actually, people participate in the study and they actually install software in your phone that register what you're looking at all the time. It takes snapshots. And then it's a big data approach. And I think that's useful, but it's not getting at the nuance, ethnographic nuance of what's happened. So what we did was, we did interviews, which of course is partial. We also did observation in lunchrooms. If you know Woodrow Wilson High School, it's got a very big lunchroom, and we would go just observe kids and sit there and watch and just record stuff. And then we did a series of follow-up interviews. But it's actually really, really hard to get nuanced data. And that's partially the demographic. Again, teenagers are not going to want to tell strangers, as I think anyone, the full intimacies of what they do with their phone. And I certainly don't need to know everything they do with their phone. But so I think one of the challenges with these devices is how to develop ethnographic methods that actually get at that lived experience of using these things. And we certainly found that doing the interviews after we did observations, surveys can only get you so far, begin to get at some of these things. One of the things that we did find is that the teenagers had no problem talking about their cell phones. And doing a longitudinal study over 4 years allowed us to see different things that we didn't otherwise known, right? Like, so in year 3, these things called Yonder bags came into the schools, particularly into Woodrow Wilson. And these are these devices that you put your cell phone in, and a lot of comedians use them, or concerts, and they basically block, you can't access your phone. And so that unrolled in Woodrow Wilson as a way to stop the distraction of cell phones. So one of the things that's been interesting is doing team ethnography, was doing different methods, but also then a feedback loop with research assistants of different younger ages and different genders, and of kind of what are we missing, what are they seeing, and how can we get at a more nuanced approach. So that's a long answer, but I think for me, one of the exciting things about doing this is I've never done team ethnography before. And so doing team ethnography, whether it's the cell phone repair labs to the teenagers, has been fascinating. And just working on cell phones is really difficult, and doing ethnography on it is really difficult because it's a very, very familiar object, but it's also very, very weird in a true anthropological sense. Next question I have from Catherine is, one of the most important personal uses of cell phone for some women in particular has been providing greater safety. Women who are being stalked or abused, used for safety. They're gathered around, distributed to women at risk. Another safety use, yes. Okay. So is your question then whether we're going to be addressing the ways in which cell phones are used in this sense? Yes. Yeah. Yes, we will. I mean, so I think one of the issues here is just thinking through, differential access. And so that's, these donor programs that cycle cell phones out to different people will be something we talk about. And I think in terms of access, whether we're going to do a deep dive into that, probably not. That's not on the topic, but it probably will be in the issue of influence and thinking about safety issues. So one of the challenges we've been thinking about in the post-COVID or COVID period is what are the stories we can tell about cell phones in the COVID period? How have cell phones played a role in our dealing with the pandemic? So I think health issues, that's where I would fit that in. And so this is where this kind of discussions with an educator we will have, as well as kind of this game that we're working on with cards, a kind of prompt discussion game will play in. But yeah, that's a good point. People taking videos of official misuse, such as police, right? Yeah, and so, I mean, it's very important to talk about Black Lives Matter. So we want to feature that as part of the show. You can imagine one of the things with the show that's very interesting is, Smithsonian or natural history, Smithsonian doesn't take stances on a particular topic, right? We can't say X is bad, Y is good. But what we can do is give people information about what's happening. And so something that we have online, but, there's certain things that we can talk about, that being one that, we're going to unpack what it means. So this is why we're doing it through Constant Connection. So what are the kind of good and bad aspects of the fact that now everyone has a film, video machine that they can upload to the internet? What does it mean, for state to be able to surveil you through this device, as well as you to surveil the state? So yeah, we're going to unpack that. But that's a big issue. And one of the things that's interesting with potential donors, and here particularly the companies, they're also very interested in it. And there's some fascinating stories, Apple being a good example of, the federal government saying, hey, we want a backdoor to get into these devices so that we can know person X of interest, what they were sending. And Apple saying, I think very bravely, no, we're not going to do that. And so thinking through the kind of issues of encryption and that sort of stuff is part of what we're going to do, or at least have conversations about. Yeah. People can unmute and chime in too. I don't know how much longer you guys want to go, but I'm happy to entertain questions as long as they're coming.
I have a question. Well,
Yep.
had you considered, I guess it's a matter of theoretical orientation, but I had been thinking, and this is where I put Kathleen's comment in how cell phones can be used in power.
Mm.
So in Kathleen's example, it can be used to give the powerless some power, particularly in the Indian use of the apps, where there's an app when a woman or a girl is in trouble, she sends out a signal and women just congregate to protect her from all over the place. But there are other examples of power, is exactly what you said with iPhone. I hate my Android, and I hate my Android because it spies on me. So that's another issue of power. And then there's also the power with the way it's used in development. Terry pointed out some of the good ways. It's also used in a very neo-colonialist way to frame what's going on and to frame that so-called help. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
In terms of the differential power or the ways in which
In terms of, had you considered using the using one of the categorizations of cell phone as power, the double-edged sword, which you are
Yeah, I
talking.
mean, I think that's what the influence section is about, is thinking about influence and agency. And so the goal there is to, I mentioned this graphic novel. The idea is to have kind of three interlocutors, one person who hates their cell phone, one who's in the middle and not sure of it, and one who loves it. And so have this discussion in graphic novel form on the wall that will both prompt questions to the viewer or the reader, and then also situate it historically. Because I think one of the things that I've found, certainly in this work, that, and not unique in saying this, but there's this newness of new media. And how new is this technology? Well, in fact, a lot of it is supersede or builds on older technology. And the moral panics that we have about cell phones are rooted in older moral panics. So we want to kind of talk through that in terms of agency. And so the power dynamic will be there, but maybe not articulated the way you're saying. But I think, hopefully in that section, people will walk out, one, being more aware of the way it's influencing them, and how they can use it, right? And this is also where the education space comes in. We hope to basically be able to teach our visitors that these things, far from being a black box, you can actually open them up and tinker with them. And I do strongly believe that knowledge is power in this case. And so equipping our visitors with a kind of critical lens and faculty to think through their technological use and relationship would be one of the main goals of the exhibit. History, so I'm asking, Matt, has a question here. The exhibit to get into more of the history of cell phone use and work through some of the more seminal developments. Well, yeah, so we use the term cell phone, but really the show is about smartphones. But cell phone sounds better as a title than smartphone. And so, or at least I think so. The show, that kind of technological wall that I showed you of all this old stuff, or not old stuff, wonderful stuff. The first cell phone call was made in 1973, April, by an engineer from Marty Cooper, who worked for Motorola. And we're using that as a starting point, not because I want to uphold him as the inventor of the cell phone, but that phone call was the first time that the device, if you will, entered human technological kind of consciousness. The show really does revolve around smartphones, right? So 2008, 7, 8, when the iPhone rolled out, of course, the iPhone was not the first smartphone. There were earlier iterations, but the iPhone was the most popular. And so that will be part of it. But that sort of technological history is something that our colleagues at American History would do more. And so the goal here is to give a flavor of that, but to kind of root it more in a kind of anthropological, ecological model of, supply chains and, pulses. But we are going to have that in there. And the question is how much, and the sprinkling of that. But little parts of it will be there. Yeah. But Pokemon Go is a great one. And we are, the funding gods willing, going to have an augmented a VR experience. So one of the things that we were going to have, for example, is we were talking about touchscreen. Now all museums are like, oh, we can't do touchscreen. When and if we reopen, can't do touchscreen anymore. So we are actually well positioned to use cell phones now as the primary means by which people engage with stuff, because at least it's in your pocket, no one else is touching it, unless you share it with your family members or a stranger. So the cell phone will become the primary way. So obviously with something like that, VR and AR have some wonderful capacities to kind of enliven the show. but it all takes money. And so we're working right now with talking to various conversations with various companies to try to raise money within a landscape in which their primary concern is their own staff, and then how to help, different aspects of the US and more globally address COVID-19. So, but yeah, that's a great one. Will the exhibit explore the influence of cell phone and consumption? Yes. So that is primarily, that's a through line throughout the show. So one of my primary kind of guides for this, one of my favorite books and anthropologist is Sidney Mintz. And so his notion of thinking about sugar, I think it's his line is, in unearthing the history of commodities, we are exploring a history of commodities, we unearth a history of ourselves anew. So I see that as a guiding thread through the show, because I think if people understand who the many, many hands that go into making this, the labor, and demystifying that commodity chain and basically breaking through the commodity fetishism of it, we will help people to be better consumers. It will also then factor most concretely in the circular economy section, right? So in that section, when we talk about, if you decide to throw out your phone, what does that look like? We're going to use data that, there's fairly good data out there on what are the ecological impacts and economic impacts of throwing out cell phones. Surprise, surprise, most companies actually want to recycle that and reuse and resell. And so unpacking aspects of that and, issues of built-in obsolescence. What does it mean for companies to make these devices and then eventually create them updates so that they no longer work or work as efficiently as you want them to? It's been interesting talking to heads of different industry and companies. They're very aware of that issue. And so if you talk to folks in their supply chain work and then just also thinking about resources, they're very aware of that. And so circular economy and how to recapture those devices and use them anew is very, very prominent. So we will unpack that and think about that. In one of the presentations that are ways of thinking about this with school groups, I forgot the exact factor, but, it was like one year they came out with how many cell phones are disposed in the US annually. And when you look at the weight of what that would be, it works out to be something like in tons, the equivalent of 240 right whales. And if you come into our museum, we have that model of a whale. And I mention that because we use that to get people to understand the scale, or kids to understand the scale of things. But yeah, the consumption angle will be very much there. All right, so I have a question from Eleanor. Will you explore the changes in the way people make community? I'm sorry if I don't mind it. I don't know if you want me to read these. Maybe I'll just look at it quickly. One of the results in the, interesting. That's fascinating. Yeah, that's a fascinating question about the ways in which people keep social networks and make them anew.
Do you want me to elaborate?
Sorry?
You want me to elaborate?
Sure, yeah. That's a great question.
So I teach at Howard University, and I watched the cell phone come in. It was really fascinating to do that, because what you saw were, certainly, being a dinosaur myself, when I went to college, you kind of, you closed the door on your high school friends or your home or the people from your hometown. You went to college and you were forced to create community with the people there. In fact, when I had a checkered undergraduate past, but the first institution that I attended, they actually made us come together as freshmen and compose some stupid song for our dorm that we then sang in competition with other dormitories. And it was a way of creating a community between people who didn't know each other at all. And I've watched the students come on campus, and increasingly they have this really large bubble around them. And it's really hard for them to get rid of all those people that they don't necessarily really want to keep up with. You know, your high school lab partner that you just happen to be paired with because you were sitting next to them in the classroom or whatever it is, who you may not have anything in common with, and yet they carry them around, and there's a lot of etiquette around dropping friends or unfriending people, all that kind of stuff. And I also watch what it does then on campus. I think the most extreme example I saw was a girl who was in one of my classes who came to me really annoyed because she'd been stuck in a dorm room with two other girls. They didn't know each other really well. They communicated largely with their friends on cell phones and so forth. One of her roommates died.
Oh.
Had some kind of issue, health issue, died. The other two, took them a long time before they even noticed this. And
Wow.
to this girl was a particular piece of work, and to her it was, more of an inconvenience than anything else. But I was stunned because I don't see that happening in the normal interactions that, certainly when I was in college and so forth back, I can tell you in prehistory. But it was just a really interesting vignette, and then but also to watch how that bubble then surrounds people, and it makes it more difficult for them to reach out because they don't need anybody. In a sense, you can walk around with your cell phone and you're carrying everybody with you all the time. You can be talking to your mom. You can, in San Francisco, you can be talking to your boyfriend in New York, and you can be, and chatting with your girlfriend in Florida. And it's kind of like what we're all doing now, right? We're all from, it's great to see Kathleen here and Neil and other people, because you guys are out in the West Coast, all right? And so but that whole idea. So anyway, I'll shut up and let you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think the cell phone, to put on my Melanesian hat, has made us all realize how Melanesian we are. And what I mean by that is, following Marilyn Strathern and her formulation of the partible person, we are all partible. And what's wonderful about this technology is it has made us see that, the way in which we have these relationships. And this device has condensed it into fascinating ways, social media. And I say that, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but also seriously, because I do, I recognize what you're saying, and certainly the teenagers we've worked with and just my own experiences, and you probably know this, but there's a fascinating thing of Finstagram, where people have Instagram accounts, and then they have their friends and family Instagram account for, so this kind of cordoning off of, well, this is what I publicly share, and then this is what I share to an intimate circle. And it's fascinating as an anthropologist to see what the differentiation is, right? And so the ways in which cell phones have complicated things, and I think to your point, there have been contrasting people have said different things about, photography, for example. But what does it mean to live now in a world where nothing is forgotten, right? So whether it be your friends or images, that people can jig up images of you that, maybe now, your parents have put up on Facebook very innocuously when you were 5, and now people it is part of your identity when you're 25. So that is interesting. And I do think that has reshaped aspects of our personhood and relating. I don't know, I don't have a feeling whether it's bad or good, but it is certainly, it's a new thing that people have to work through, which is fascinating.
It just seems to me it's very different. There's at one point, I think it's in the exhibit on human evolution that's in your museum, and at the end it's sort of like, what will people evolve into? They give different examples, and it's almost like that. You sort of look at it and go, what is this kind of the sense of community? And certainly COVID has even heightened some aspects of that for many of us. How do we create community, and how do we maintain community with people I'm very aware of people who are isolated, for instance, who don't have somebody else at home with them, that kind of thing. And so how do you work all that? Or the discovery, and I'm sure, you've all had this discovery as well, that we could have been Zooming meetings with people we never see except once a year at the meetings, right? All this time, we're good friends, from
Right.
grad school or whatever. It's like, what were we thinking? We could have had cocktails anytime, and so
Yeah.
instead of just seeing them once a year. So, I mean, I'm with you. I don't think it's good or bad. It's an observation. It's just
Yeah.
very interesting because the cell phone has really moved from, and I quote a student of mine in 2005 who called it her mother's LoJack system for keeping track of her, to, what you're talking about now, which is the partability thing, which it's just is very interesting to see how human communication is going to morph
Yep.
as we change.
Well, and there's a great book that, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend, by John Durham Peters, called Speaking into Air, A History of Communication. And he talks about, and the reason I raise it is it connects to what you're saying, is, I have the quote in front of me. He says, communication is a risky adventure without guarantees. Any kind of effort to make linkage via signs is a gamble on whatever scale it occurs. All talk is an act of faith predicated on the future's ability to bring forth the world's called for. And I raise that, and I love that quote, because I think cell phones have kind of magnified, one, our ability to reach out and talk to each other, but then also the worries we have, are we being understood? And so that's where the kind of media ecology aspect of it and how it sits within the kind of other modalities in which we communicate as humans, face-to-face, via Zoom, via whatever, audio only, versus our media ideologies and the ideology of what is acceptable. And that's I think, for me, the ideology aspect of what is permissible and what isn't is fascinating. And that's what we're hoping to kind of get our visitors to talk about, so that they can have the sort of conversations or raise those issues that you're astutely raising. So yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I've had parent or teachers tell me, and I don't know how to take this, that they think that kids now just don't know how to talk to each other anymore. It's fascinating. And it's them being a teacher. It was a teacher I met in middle school at Edmund Burke School. And he just said, look, my students don't know how to talk to each other anymore. They don't know how to do small talk. And I don't know. I don't know the data. I don't have the data in front of me. But I raise that because I think what's happening, of course, is different forms of talk. Like my 11-year-old son now, we got him a cell phone. He started middle school. And as you guys know who are in DC, if you have kids, middle school is generally when kids in DC get cell phones, because they need to take public transportation. And my son has his phone, and now, everything's on Zoom, and he's got his phone jacked up in front of his computer with his friends on. So he's got the teacher on mute, and he's got his friends on FaceTime, and he's chatting with them. And I walk in and I'm like, what's going on? He's like, oh, I'm in class. Like, but what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm just chatting. I'm like, okay, but are you listening? Yes. And so I raised that because he's able to, and I don't know how, parse out all these different conversations and, be able to do multiple things at once, which I find fascinating and just difficult at the same time to wrap my head around. And yeah, it's fascinating.
They don't always do them successfully. I'm grading papers right now. Just want to put that in there.
No, I agree. But just today I walked in, I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm doing homework. And I said, well, how can you do your homework with your friends there? And he's like, oh no, I do it much better when they're present. I'm like, okay, I'll check in with you later today and we'll see how that works. But yeah. Oh, thank you, Bill, appreciate it. Any other questions? I don't know how we're doing for time. I don't want to go over time, keep people from whatever they have for this afternoon, or it's not afternoon, evening.
We usually can go up till 9, but that's because we have to get out of Sumner School at 9. So
Okay.
we can stop now if you'd like to, or we can keep going.
People have questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
Didn't see anything more come up on the chat, so we maybe,
Maybe we'll run the course. But I will say this, one of the things that we will be doing, and we're rolling things out. We're very interested, for those of you professors who are in local universities, I have strongest connections. So I teach as an adjunct at GW. I have strongest connections there, but I have contacts at American, actually none at Howard. But we're fascinated to one of the things that we are doing now is trying to roll out a survey for the demographics. So we're looking at high school and college age kids and to try to get their feedback, because we're trying to pitch certain things in particular ways. So if people are interested, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to be in touch. And we are going to be rolling out things as the year progresses. So for example, we are going to probably do an Easter egg thing in the exhibit where we're going to have a competition to develop emojis based on some of our collections. And then the winning emojis, we will hide the emoji somewhere in the exhibit, and so you have to find it. And so hopefully that will become a neat thing for kids to do. But yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned a lot about doing this show is, as the writers like to say, that doing an exhibit is not writing a book. And I've done exhibits before, but never of this size. And then, sometimes your favorite children don't get onto the bus. So you have to cut things, and that's been really hard. I had a meeting the other day where, I was told that once the designer started fitting in the text for this one mining panel, that a lot of the stuff we were going to have to edit out. And I got very upset and disgruntled. And the writer explained that, everything is of course important, but one of the challenges for a show like this, and we have enough data to be able to say this reasonably, is we know how long people spend reading panels. So how do we put enough text that people will keep reading? And so it's not putting all the text you want, but enough that you see the information that people will kind of come back or seek out more information. And so for a topic like this, there's a lot of surfaces to scratch and dig down deeper to. So I think one of the biggest things is that balance of, depth versus breadth, which is a good challenge to have. But yeah, but nice to meet you all. I recognize some of you from other things, so it's great to kind of see you virtually. So
Pamela, if you can unmute
Yes.
everyone, we can give Joshua a round of applause for an amazing talk. Thank you.
yes, thank you very much.
thank you.
Moody, unmute.
Thanks, Pamela, for pulling it off too.
Yeah, really.
Yeah,
Thank
Pamela, that
you.
was great. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, Joshua, you get a free year's membership in WAPA.
Ooh,
So we
fantastic.
get to see you at other Zoom meetings.
That would be great. That would be great. No, it's been wonderful.
Josh, I'll be happy to talk to you about Howard stuff if you want.
Okay, that'd be great.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'll just throw, you probably all know my email, but I'll throw my email up right here. It's a very easy way to be in touch, but
Well, thank you all so much. Stay tuned. This is the last scheduled meeting of our season. Our normal season would be, but who knows what's coming up next. We'll make sure you all know. I hope it's soon. And it's great to see all of you. So have a great evening.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
being
you.
so
Bye,
patient.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Joshua.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Okay.